Good evening. My name is Heather Burgess, and myself and my classmate Kristen Judry are in a multicultural counseling class at Montreat College. And for our group project that we were assigned, we wanted to highlight Asian Americans. But before we get too far into it, I wanted to define how the United States categorizes Asian American peoples. The United States federal government categorizes Asian Americans as any people having their origins in the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. However, there are 6 main groups of Asian Americans, and Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, or Japanese. And of these groups, I have this chart up here. The largest section, the largest group out of them Asian Americans are Chinese at 22.8%, and they are right there in the blueberry color. Japanese is the smallest group at 5.2%, they're right here. And then this group is comprised of all the other Asian peoples, including Hmong, Cambodian, Bangladeshi, comprise that 14.9%. Asian Americans are the largest, fastest growing population within the United States. And actually North Carolina is number 3 for the fastest growing Asian American population of over 225,000. And these charts right here just kind of give you an idea of the breakdown from the census of 2010. Whites are 64%, Hispanics 16%, African American 14%, and Asian American 6%. And then this chart down here at the bottom shows North Carolina at 85%, the states with the highest growth of Asian Americans, with Nevada and Arizona being the ones that top them. And the growth we're seeing from this population tops, as far as the speed of growth, tops even the Hispanic population. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Crystal.
There are many factors to consider when understanding the Asian American culture. According to Hayes and Efford, there are roughly 43 ethnic groups with 20 different countries having each unique values, beliefs, and attitudes. Although each group has different lifestyles, each share fundamental common values. The level of involvement of the values can depend on each family's acculturation status. How well did the family integrate into mainstream society while keeping their cultural values? The immigration story also plays a huge part in the family's level of participation of the original cultural system. The generation of each is also a part of the process. For example, a third-generation Asian American child may speak fluent English, whereas a first-generation may only speak his or her native language. A study was conducted with 163 Asian American college students in which they received a questionnaire regarding the research assumed collective values amongst the Asian American population. A sample question was, should one work hard in order to not displease the family unit? The majority of the college students stated that working hard in order to not displease the family was very important. The family unit is a major component in the Asian American system of beliefs. The majority of the population views the family unit as more important than the individual's needs. If a family member chooses to make decisions that are not in the best interests of the family unit, he or she may experience shame from the family. This is one of the ways the family disciplines the members. The family also acknowledges the esteem of elders. The children are expected to respect the adults and be obedient. The study results indicated there are predominant overarching values in the Asian American population. The families adhere to the cultural values have more success in acculturation. Education is a valued practice of the Asian American culture. The most likely fields would be lawyers or doctors. A few enter into politics, pursue acting, or other types of public figure careers. There are Asian American culture figures and a handful of Asian American national politicians. The population is likely to serve the community. For example, pro bono work as a lawyer or work at a public clinic. Self-control is also highly regarded, staying outwardly emotionally grounded. When counseling someone from this population, it is important for the counselor to understand they may not express themselves outwardly. The counselor should be sensitive to this value and not push the client to open up in the way the counselor expects.
Okay, the next category that we're going to explore are perceptions, stereotypes, and misperceptions of Asian Americans. And while there are quite a few, there are two main ones that have had a huge influence on this group. The first one is yellow peril. Yellow peril, that stereotype depicts Asian Americans as drug users, lawbreakers, they're immoral and heathen. This stereotype originated when Japanese and Chinese immigration started and white Americans were fearful of their jobs, the economic advantages they felt like the Asian Americans would get, as well as their customs and their culture were very different from what white Americans were used to. So it brought about a certain element of fear. They were very apprehensive of those differences. The second main stereotype is model minority. And in this particular thought process, it started in the 1960s. And what this particular stereotype says is that Asian Americans, they don't deal with racism at all. They are law-abiding. They are able to acculturate into the American culture very easily. They don't have any problems. They're high achievers and they're upwardly mobile. So there is considered like the perfect type of group. And what happens with this particular perception is that Asian Americans are kind of invisible to what's happening to the psychological world, to the legal world, because everybody just kind of writes them off as being, they're fine, there's nothing wrong, there are no issues we need to address. So both this particular stereotype can send really mixed messages to people, both to Asian Americans and people around them. And it can represent, it can communicate respect as well as acrimony toward the Asian American people. These two particular stereotypes represent obviously very opposite ends of the spectrum on thought, and depending on who the particular individual is relating with, they, at any given time, they could be dealing with both, one or the other of these particular stereotypes, and that can be excessively stressful for the individual. Additional stereotypes, just a few, there are quite many, is the perpetual foreigner. They can never be a citizen. They're perpetually foreigners. That they are, Asian Americans are always family focused. They always practice martial arts, but they don't practice sports. They're not good at sports. All Asian Americans are the same, regardless of what group they're from, what country they're from. They're always good at math, and they are very poor communicators. This is a survey that was done, and they just asked different people to answer general questions. And in general, it said the attitude toward Chinese Americans specifically was very negative, about 25%, somewhat negative, 43%, but there were only 32% who had a positive attitude towards Chinese American. Negative stereotypes about Chinese Americans, that they have too much influence in the US and high up in the technology sector. And it was probably true, was 34%, which is a fairly sizable number. Another question was, were Chinese people more loyal to their home country than to the US? And 32% again said that that was probably true. So there are a lot of negative perceptions that a lot of people may not even consciously process to realize how they are perceiving Asian Americans. But that can still be felt and seen in microaggressions toward Asian Americans. There were some major historical events that have happened throughout U.S. history and abroad that have had influence on the Asian American people. On the one hand, the United States has tried to curtail immigration from Asian countries, but on the other hand, they also want to prevent a possible military invasion. So there was a lot of perception that Asians wanted to invade us, and those prejudices were not new. They originated back during the 1100s, during the time of Genghis Khan. And then they came back up to the forefront in Europe again when Kaiser Wilhelm II was having dreams that Asian invaders were coming to take over Europe. So fear led, and those fears from Europe, came over and were seen in the United States. And fear led to many anti-immigration laws, restrictions on citizenship and land ownership, and the ability to intermarry with white people. Asian Americans have the highest rate per capita of crimes perpetuated against them as a whole. And counselors need to be aware that when Asian Americans come in to counseling, that the crime is often underreported by Asian Americans as well. And there are a couple of reasons I'm going to go through really quickly. The first being the language barrier, and that's not just because of communicating what's transpired. It also includes being able to read the paperwork, to be able to understand the questions being asked in the paperwork and the legal system, which leads to the second thing is their inexperience working with the American law system is often extremely complicated to a person who's not from this country and very unfamiliar. The third is mistrust and bad experiences with police and law enforcement. And some of that is immigrants within our country who've had bad experiences, or immigrants who've come in from countries, particularly like China or North Korea, who are oppressive, have communist regimes, and their law enforcement and military are often corrupt and abuse their power. So they come in already with a really negative viewpoint of what law enforcement might be, so they're scared to go talk to law enforcement, either because of an experience like that or for fear it might highlight that they might be here illegally. Even as recent as this year, the Asian American Coalition for Education has brought a federal complaint against Yale, Dartmouth, and Harvard, accusing them, alleging that they require higher SAT scores for Asian Americans to be admitted than they do whites and African Americans. So it's still very much an issue today. Violence has been something that has been seen quite often in the history of Asian Americans. In Los Angeles, Chinatown in Los Angeles in 1871, there were two Chinese factions who were fighting, and a rancher got caught in the crossfire and killed. So at that time, about over 100 men went into Chinatown, looted the area, and lynched about 17 Chinese men. Then in 1885, Rock Springs, Wyoming, the miners were very disgruntled. The white miners were very disgruntled. The the Chinese miners were willing to take much lower pay, and therefore the mining company was paying them much lower pay, and they were very angry about it. There were a lot of threats, a lot of warnings, but all of that culminated in 500 men marching onto the Chinatown area and that area, along with women and children, and they killed quite a few Asian people. The number ended up being 28 men with 15 injured, and women were taking part in the killings, and they burned the whole living area to the ground. The last one, although there were quite a few, is in 1982, Vincent Chin was murdered. He was a Chinese American. He was murdered the night before his wedding by two automotive workers who were, their perception was that Japanese automakers were taking away their jobs. So they mistook him for a Japanese origin, and they brutally beat and killed him. They only were fined $3,700 each and 3 years probation. And obviously there was a lot of outrage about that. Laws to curtail and prohibit immigration. The first one was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this was in 1882, and it refused entry of new Chinese immigrants for 10 years, and it was actually one of the first laws to make immigration a criminal offense. The second one was the Scott Act. That was in 1888, and it prohibited the return of Chinese immigrants who had traveled abroad. So if you had traveled abroad to visit family or anything of that nature, this law prohibited you from coming back. And then the Gresham-Yang Treaty. This was in 1894, and it banned all Chinese immigration, except for the ones who had been here before and had traveled abroad and allowed their re-entry into the country. Then the Barred Zone Immigration Act. This one set parameters allowing the United States to refuse immigrants based on their physical deformities and illnesses. And then the Immigration Act of 1924 limited immigration to 2%, which was much more restrictive than the former 3% that was the previous limit. In the 50s and 60s, more laws were passed that allowed immigrants to become citizens, that set the restrictions on the number of Asian immigrants to equal that of European immigrants, to make that a level field, and it allowed intermarriage between races. And during this time, as a side note, the courts often upheld these laws, and their viewpoint was that they deferred to Congress and allowed Congress to control the laws and restrictions regarding aliens. So there were several lawsuits, and each time the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States. Some of the modern historical events were the Japanese internment camps. It has been said that there were several thousand, probably 10,000 or more, in some of these camps that were located. They were given 3 days to vacate their homes and move into these camps, and that was after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it was by the Executive Order 9066, and in that they lost everything. And these were also, Japanese were deported up here from Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela. So it was not just Japanese Americans. Several countries rounded up Japanese and sent them here to California. The Hiroshima bombing in Tiananmen Square, Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Tiananmen Square, those were both events that, while they did happen abroad, they've had a huge impact on peoples who live within the United States, Asian Americans, as well as people, because of the close family ties between Asian Americans. While that is not always an exact thing between every single Asian family, that is a value that they hold with family loyalty, and so that is something that would definitely impact people who were here. Also, directly after 9/11, racial profiling happened, and there was a lot of violence, and it was not just against Muslims. Indian Sikhs were often mistaken for Muslims because they were wearing turbans, and so they bore a huge brunt of violence as well. There are many opportunities and barriers that Asian Americans encounter within the United States, and one is the education. As a whole, they have a large number of people who possess college degrees, which afford more employment opportunities for them. However, leadership or managerial positions are often harder to attain because Asian Americans often don't fit the criteria that white Americans deem necessary for a successful leader. So while they might possess the education and they might have more opportunities, it often still doesn't make a huge difference, just depending. Language barriers and level of acculturation can also be huge barriers for Asian Americans. Based on the 2010 census, 70.5% of Asian Americans did not use English in their home, and they possess limited English proficiency, which can obviously be a huge barrier when applying for jobs, colleges, schools, other things of that nature. The inability of our dominant language of English can also impact healthcare. Them being willing or being able to go and effectively get healthcare.
Asian Americans are one of the 10% of the population. As a minority group, Asian Americans face difficult challenges merging into the mainstream American society. Even though this culture is considered homogeneous, there are so many subcultures. It makes it difficult for research to be completed on specific identities of the collective culture in all the subcultures. Asian Americans are defined as Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese, with the Chinese being the largest group and the Japanese being the smallest. The Indians and Filipinos led Asian Americans in household wealth. Asian Americans vote most liberally. The Japanese and Filipinos are most likely to marry outside of their group. More Chinese Americans than any other Asian American group say they are doing better materially than their parents were at their age. In older research, the more an ethnic group kept with traditional values, the less the group would be successful in assimilating into white American culture. In previous research conducted, the results showed some Asian American groups could have a positive correlation of strong ethnic identity and successful acculturation. Positive ethnic identity and successful acculturation leads to psychological health. This study suggests keeping ethnic identity separate from acculturation. In other words, keeping a cultural tradition within the group and trying to understand mainstream culture when out in the world. Chinese Americans showed a high level of psychological well-being in regards to ethnic identity and moderate acculturation. The Korean Americans were more assimilated but did not score as high on the psychological health screening. The Japanese Americans scored high on the screening but did not correlate to successful acculturation. Asian American people may seek counseling to help with this process. It is vital to understand the immigration background of the client as well as the specific subculture he or she belongs to. For example, in East India, people prefer to seek out help from family members or religious leaders. A multicultural competent counselor will also examine the level of success the client is having at acculturation. It is the client living in a well-knit, ethnically aligned neighborhood? Does the client have a job and is able to pay the bills? All these questions will help the counselor understand the individual's background and what he or she is hoping to get out of the therapeutic process. The Asian American gender roles. Gender is defined as what is expected and the roles of a male or female should adhere to within the society. For the Asian American, gender roles are based out of a patriarchal mindset and are defined within the family unit. For example, sex and age are valued within the family unit and responsibilities are shared amongst everyone. Some theorists believe it is biology which defines gender roles, and others state it is the culture that dictates the expectations. Traditionally, Asian American men seem to have a unique gender role. The men are expected to be very masculine in society and also appear effeminate. For Asian American men, the masculinity issue is about who one is and how one relates to family and relatives, loved ones, emotional partners, close friends, and acquaintances. It also is related to the ways one presents oneself to the world at the workplace, at school, in leisure situations, and other public gatherings. It is in these ways Asian American men reproduce and negotiate gender relations with women and other men in their lives. Historically, Asian men were treated poorly in America. The population of men was seen as aggressive and dirty. White male workers would view Asian male workers as deviants who wanted to rape white women. This dates back to the 1850s when there was tension hiring Asian American men. They were cheap labor, but they were also villainized. This perception shapes the attitudes and expectations of Asian American gender roles. Another facet to the expectations is how the media portrays them. People will often see Asian American men as smart and nerdy, funny, and heavily involved in martial arts. The culture of men is not typically portrayed as sexual beings and pushed into very emasculating roles. There was a study within a 45-minute question that was conducted to find out how Asian American and white American men view masculinity, women, and gender roles. Asian American men stated, on average, that masculinity is attractive, fun, cute, and sexually exciting. The white American population perception of masculinity was a strong personality, high income, sexually exciting, and dominant. And speaking of sexuality and sexual orientation, in the broad sense of the culture, Asian American sexuality is focused on procreation. It is viewed in a conservative perspective within the context of marriage. There is little sexual education taught in school, and it is not openly discussed by the parents to the children. In the traditional Cambodian culture, the adults thought if sex education was not taught, there would be no premarital sex that would dishonor the family. While Filipino culture has a strong Catholic influence, which suggests it is morally wrong to have premarital sex, use contraceptives, and have an abortion. Many women of the Asian American population do not see a doctor for feminine issues. A study in San Francisco revealed that over 70% of Asian American women in the area had never had a mammogram, pap smear, or a breast exam. There is not much research pertaining to Asian Americans and sexuality, and this might be because of how conservative they are. The research that has been conducted reports that Asian Americans are more sexually conservative than non-Asian Americans. The percentage of college students being virgins is much higher than the white student population. There is even less information and research on sexual orientation with the Asian American population. This ties into the family unit being more important than the individual's needs. There's a small percentage of gay, lesbian, and bisexual that represent the culture. In one report, the people who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual are more comfortable in the LBG community than they are in their own Asian American culture. And only 26% of the Asian American LGBT community had shared their sexual orientation to the family. The research also shows that many Asian American homosexuals fall into the sexual stereotype. For example, homosexual men take the more effeminate role, where the homosexual women take the more masculating role. Many in the LGBT community still regard the family more important, and some do not want to bring shame on the family. However, it is hypothesized that the more Asian Americans will become more open while being immersed in the white American culture. It is possible for a counselor to have an Asian American LGBT client. Understanding the importance of the family dynamic and shame will be helpful in working with the individual. The counselor should not discount how sharing his or her sexual orientation could disrupt the family bond in a severe way. The counselor could also be knowledgeable in how to overcome shame.
Okay, we're going to look at physical and mental disabilities now. Within the Asian culture, disabilities are often perceived negatively, and individuals with disabilities are often viewed as worthless and incapable of learning. So there's a huge stigma that surrounds people with disabilities. One of the things has to do with saving face. Physical disabilities and mental disabilities can be viewed as shameful and stigmatic because of that whole cultural belief about, respect and honor, and that's summed up with saving face. Congenital and disabilities that children are born with are often more accepted than, they're not as accepted as disabilities that happen to a person that is uncontrollable, such as they got into an accident at work and had to have a leg amputated or something of that nature. Those type of injuries and disabilities are viewed more favorably, and part of it goes toward cause, because the Asian American culture is very focused on cause for disabilities, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. They're often considered to be a result of diet or emotional disturbances, something that the pregnant woman has done that has caused a congenital birth defect or some sort of mental defect, like in their view, mental defect or mental disorder like Down syndrome. Health disorders in general are often considered to have spiritual sources, such as evil spirits, the person had bad character, or it's the judgment of the gods. Because Asian cultures tend to focus on the cause so strongly, it's often very beneficial to talk to them about what has caused this disability, what has caused this mental health disorder, and educate them on exactly what is happening so that they'll be more accepting of the individual, and the individual will even be more accepting of the disability, depending on what it is. Because Asian Americans are very family focused, they often won't seek help outside of the family because they view it as the family's responsibility to care for the individual. Additionally, Asian Americans often, and Asians in general, often tend to present with somatic complaints as opposed to, I'm feeling sad. They might come in with headaches, gastrointestinal issues, fatigue, that type of thing. That is actually the result or the symptom of something like depression, but that's not how they perceive it. They perceive it in a physical way. Able-bodied individuals are highly valued, but there are higher expectations and more pressure to succeed placed on them. Academics, occupational choices, who they marry, their goals in life, all of these are they're determined and shaped by the family, and their expectations that individual is expected to attain in order to bring honor to the family. So while there is value in their culture, extreme value for able-bodied individuals, there's also a great deal of culture and a great deal of pressure and stress, and therefore it can lead to mental health disorders. In general, overall, Asian Americans have a higher percentage of college degree attainment, median household income, and per capita income. And this is in general. When this is examined further, however, certain segments of the Asian American population, such as the Hmong, Bangladeshi, and Cambodians, they actually have a higher percentage of families and children who live below the federal poverty line compared to the American population as a whole. So it's basically the best and worst. So overall, they have a really high percentage, but within that group, they also have some of the poorest people within the United States. So they're also considered to be the most educated of all immigrant groups. There's a very high percentage of Asian immigrants who come into the United States with a bachelor's degree or higher. And that is important to know because that's people coming into the U.S. as opposed to people who already possess who obtain their degree within the U.S. But looking at religion and faith, the Asian culture is extremely diverse. And this topic right here with religion and faith, it can vary immensely between different countries within Asia, and it can also vary a great deal within one particular culture. And there can be a lot of overlap just depending, but I'm going to highlight a couple of countries and a couple of the main religions. One of the main religions in Japan is Shinto, and that religion basically it means ways of the gods. And this was the religion that worshipped the emperor. It was changed, and it was one of the biggest things that led to some of the issues with them surrendering during after World War II. Was the expression of this religion. Overall, Japanese are unobservant within the country, but the ones who do observe Shinto, Buddhism, or a mix between the two of those. Of those who are unobservant, a lot of them still will observe traditional services or rites, just as a part of their culture, not really as a religious expression for them. Confucianism is one of the primary religions in China. And another one is, Buddhism. Christianity is a huge population, or a huge faith within China. And there's a lot of persecution with the Falun Gong and Christianity. There are a great many Asian Americans who immigrate to, especially Chinese, who immigrate to the United States to seek religious asylum. So that can be a huge thing to be aware of when counseling an Asian American, particularly if they're from an area like China or North Korea. There's some persecution that happens in other countries, but since 2013, persecution in the area of Christians has just really amped up, and so that's a really huge problem right now. In China, the government controls religious expression with the observance, the determination for the observance of that religion determined by whether or not they conform and support or promote government within China. So that is why Christianity is not why it's persecuted so badly, and Falun Gong is persecuted badly as well. Confucianism is moral as opposed to religious, and its ethics and accepted guidelines center more on men ruling over women, parents ruling over children, the educated people ruling over the uneducated people. So it's really kind of about how to live, instructions how to live, as opposed to really a strong faith-based type religion. Taoism and Buddhism are also observed in China. And in South Korea, Confucianism and Buddhism are followed along with Roman Catholicism, and there's a strong Protestant population within South Korea. So we're finished with our presentation. Bottom line, Asian Americans have a very rich and cultural heritage, and they have great diversity. So it's really important to learn about the people as a whole, to observe and learn what their faith, what their culture means to them as you're counseling them, and really build that relationship, because there are a lot of cultural differences that can hinder that if you're not willing to be open and really learn who the individual is. Thank you very much.